This will be the third installment or the third sermon on the parables of Christ. Now, it's my intentions to go through all the parables of Christ, but I may break it up and speak on various other subjects in between, but eventually we'll get through them all, I hope. Some of the parables of Christ are well known, such as the sower and the seed. And some of the parables, Christ gives explanations for those about those parables to the disciples and to us. And some he doesn't. He just leaves it hanging out there for us to kind of ponder on and to think about. The parable of the wheat and tares, which is the last parable we went through in my last sermon. And some are, as I said, some are well known, and some are not so well known. And I would like to start with one of those today, because this parable's thought and the thought of the parable of the wheat and the tares are so closely related, closely connected. And that is the parable of the seine net, or some call it a parable of the drag net. Now, some of you may know what a seine net is. Some of you may not. Growing up, we used to seine the creek for minnows to use for bait to catch larger fish with. Some of you may have done this, and you know what I'm talking about. The seine net is a net which has corks at the top, and weights at the bottom, so it kind of stands up in the water, so to speak. And it has ropes attached to four corners. It's four corners, and as you draw it through the water, as it is drawn through the water, it forms a cone-shaped cavity into which are swept all kinds of things and all kinds of creatures. We not only caught minnows when we seined the creek. Sometimes we would catch crawdads. And by the way, crawdads make good fish bait too. But sometimes you may catch a water snake, which is something totally undesirable. But in Galilee, however, there was a much larger version of this net. And they also caught all kinds of things and all kinds of sea creatures. The net was then drawn ashore or to the boat, and the fishermen, they sat down and they sorted out its varied contents. The fish that could be used were put into vessels. Now, these vessels may have been, I'm not saying for certain, but they may have been water tanks where they could keep the fish alive and fresh until delivered to the market. But the useless, undesirable, and unusable things were cast away. This parable also gives us a vivid picture of the kingdom, and it throws light on the church, which is the instrument of the kingdom upon the earth. Let's see here. Let's read this parable, so we'll get a little more understanding of what I'm talking about here. If I can find it here, I didn't write it down where it was at. Okay, it's in verse 47 of chapter 13 of Matthew. It says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a net that was cast into the sea and gathered of every kind." So it gathered all kinds of different things. "Which when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. So shall it be at the end of the world." The end of this age. "The angel shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. All right. That's the parable. And as I read these parables and we go through them, it's, as I said, Christ sometimes leaves us to figure out or to sort out what he's trying to tell us. And there's been various different interpretations of some of these parables, and that's what I want to put forth to you to give you something to think about. As I said, this parable gives us a picture of the kingdom, and it throws light on the church, which is the instrument of the kingdom upon the earth. Stress is put on the fact that the seine net gathers into its cone every kind of creature and thing. And those of you who've been in the church for a while knows the church has caught a whole lot of other things besides menace down through the years. For some unknown reason, we seem to attract all the nuts in the world. I don't know why that's true, but we do. So this paints a picture that what Christ came to this earth to do was not only for the church, but for the whole world, because it captures everything. And it lays down the fact that we must not be selective as to who we preach the gospel to. And we have been that way, the church has in times past. Throughout the years, we have come to think automatically that the gospel is for every man. But to the ancient world, this was not so. They didn't think this way. In the ancient world, everywhere you looked, it was a world of barriers and contempts. And there's still a lot of barriers and contempts in this, even today, that exist even today. But especially so in the ancient world. In the Greek world, there were three great divisions. Number one, there was a division between the Greek and the barbarian. The Greek was the man who spoke Greek, that beautiful, flexible, meaningful language, of which men did well to be proud of. And there was the man who uttered unclothed sounds in a strange tongue. Made a big difference there. The Greek began by looking with contempt on the man who knew no Greek. Number two, there was the division between the slave and the free man. In ancient Greece, that was much more than a mere economic and social distinction. In their eyes, it was a fundamental difference, a great difference. Aristotle had laid down that there were certain men and women born to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. And to improve their status in life was wrong, because they existed solely to relieve the cultured class from the routine task of life and work. Therefore, the freeborn Greek looked with contempt upon the slave. And things like this makes my blood boil, folks, to think certain people can be so arrogant in their thinking. However, it seems the more people are educated in the ways of the world, the more arrogant they become. Number three, there was the division in Greece between the wise and the ignorant, or the unlearned, I should say. Plato had written above the door of his academy, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." There were the philosophers who spent their lives seeking to become wise in the things of God and men. And there were the others. From the way they looked at it, there was us and there's the others. The simple folk with simple minds. It's the way they looked upon people. And the wise men, or that is the people who profess to be wise, or the so-called learned men, looked with contempt on whom they deemed as being uneducated. Nothing but arrogance. This was nothing more than arrogance on their part. Then there was the Roman world, which, broadly speaking, divided men into Roman citizens and the rest. The rest. You're either a Roman or you're just the rest, some of the rest. There were the Romans, and there were the lesser breeds of people in their eyes. Again, nothing but arrogance. There was a time at the height of the Roman greatness when Rome saw her destiny as the task of imposing just and equitable law on the world, of bringing the Roman peace, as they called it, to all the world, of casting down the arrogant. And they were the arrogant, but they thought of other people as being arrogant, and sparing the conquered. However, in later years, when Rome began to disintegrate, Rome largely saw the world as a place to be exploited for the ease and comfort of the Roman citizen. Now we come to the Jewish world. The Jewish world, however, had more barriers than anyone, believe it or not. Number one, there was the barrier between the Jew and the Gentile. At their most extreme and most arrogant, the Jews believed that they were the only nation in the world for whom God cared for. And they could say the most terrible things when it comes to the Gentiles. The best of the Gentiles should be killed. Those serpents should be crushed. The Lord is only gracious to Israel. Other nations should be crushed. The heathen, they're not to be pushed in a pit, but if they fall in, there's no reason why they should be helped out. That's the way they thought of things. The Jew looked with contempt on the man of any other race. And again, this is nothing but arrogance. In Jewish society, there was also the barrier between man and woman. Officially, and I say officially, men expressed themselves as being more important than the women in the Jewish community. Now, that's not to say there were not some of the truest of family relationships among the Jews, for we see examples in the Bible of where there was some good relationships. But in his morning prayer, the Jew, especially the religious leaders, thank God that thou hast not created me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. So that's how the Pharisees and the scribes thought. It was considered to educate a woman was the equivalent of casting pearls before swine. The strict rabbi would not be seen talking to a woman in public, not even his wife or his sister. And that's why the disciples questioned Jesus about this very thing when he was talking to the woman at the well. I mean, it was just religious leaders just didn't talk to women in public. Well, no man did. The official attitude was women existed only for limited reasons, which was to take care of the man. And that, sadly to say, still around a lot. Number three, there was the barrier between the man who kept the law and the man who did not keep the law. The Pharisees kept every small detail of the ceremonial law. They had a technical term for the people who did not. They called them the people of the land. There's us and there's just the people of the land. It was nothing more than a crime for one who kept the law to marry or allow any of his family to marry one of the common people of the land, as they called them. They wouldn't do business with them. They wouldn't give them any hospitality, nor would they receive any hospitality from them. They would not even share or go on a journey with them. They had a saying, he who gives bread to a man who observes not the law will suffer for it. So they wouldn't even give bread to somebody out here if that person wasn't keeping the law, according to them. They had another contempt for anyone who did not keep the law, which, by the way, was mostly their own made-up laws. There was the barrier between good and bad, which was largely interpreted on terms of keeping the law or the ceremonial law. But it went far beyond that, for some were prepared to say, there is joy in heaven over one sinner who is wiped out, which in fact, God's opinion is the very opposite of that. In Luke 15:7, we read there is joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. So we can see their attitude. And nowhere is this better seen than in John 8, verses 1 through 11. in the story of the woman taken in adultery. According to the Jewish law, those who wished to stone the woman were correct according to the law. That's what the law said. The penalty was laid down for one taken in the act of adultery was he or she be stoned to death. However, they had let the man go here and brought only the woman before Jesus, when, in fact, they should have both, according to law, be stoned. What people fail to see in this story is that the ones who wished to stone the woman did not regard the stoning as something they must carry out with sorrow because of the penalty of the law, but it was something they were going to do which they would find grim and sadistic joy in. Of course, we know Jesus let the woman go because their sins were just as great as hers. This was typical of the attitude of those who regarded themselves as good to those whom they considered bad. That is why the Jewish leaders were shocked to the core when Jesus showed himself to be friends of sinners and outcasts. These people had a better-than-thou attitude. And, of course, this still goes on today to some degree. This parable stresses the fact that Jesus came to the earth and died, not only for the Jew, not only for those in the church, excuse me, but for the whole world. God gave Peter the vision of all those unclean animals to stress this fact. We see from the Bible how new of an idea that it was to the ancient world. And, you know, for there still exists the sin of exclusivism and of contempt, even today. Have you ever felt a little contempt for someone who you thought was a rung or two lower on the ladder than you? There is an obvious instance of color prejudice in our world today, just as there was in the ancient world. And it's not only the prejudice of the white against the black, it also exists of the black towards the white, and the black and the white against the Orientals and the Latinos. So it's not just a one-way thing, as some make it out to be. Even as we try to overcome this prejudice, too often our attitude towards people of other colors, or even of a different social status, is shown in 1 Timothy 6, 1 and 2, where one was the master, and I'm not going to turn there, and one was the servant. They were both believers of the Word. They were both in the church. It is only that of being gracious and not of actually treating all men as having the same potential as ourselves, which is to be children in the kingdom of God, to be spiritual brothers. We can be kind to someone of another color, but to actually, in our minds, to think of them as brothers in the kingdom, somehow people can't conceive that. So if at any time we feel this attitude of contempt, or realize that we're drifting into exclusiveness, we must remember this parable tells us that the kingdom is like a net which gathers everything. For Jesus came in an attempt to save sinners, the sinners, of which we all are, folks, as well as the righteous. We can also look at this another way. In doing so, it will enable us to understand a problem that is very real, and also to give us an answer to a very common accusation against the church. There is in this parable the implication the church will always be a mixture of people. One of the accusations against the church is that it has so many unsatisfactory members, and that the people inside are no better than the people outside. However, the plain implication of this parable is that it can't be any other way, because the net as it sweeps through the water, gathers all kinds of things into itself. And so does the church people. We gather all kinds of people. And we know that this same accusation and principle was leveled at Jesus himself. He was accused of being surrounded by extremely unsatisfactory people. Yet his answer in Matthew 9:12 still holds true. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but it is those who are sick. Would anyone dare make an accusation against a hospital who was full of people that was ill? It is precisely to take sick people in that a hospital exists. That's why they exist. Its job, the reason for its being, is to help sick people get well. So there's something wrong with any church which has no effect on the lives of its members. And a church which welcomes sinners is only fulfilling its true function. But a lot of people won't let a sinner, so they think, walk through their doors. Some of my in-laws went to a church like that. Therefore, we must remember two things. First, if the church were a place for perfect people, there wouldn't be a one of us sitting in this room today, or any other church. The room would be empty. And there's an old saying, it's not so much where a man is as it is to which direction he's facing. So it's evident that the church must remain a mixture of people until the end if it is to act as the physician of Christ. And if the people in it are facing in the right direction, that is, facing Christ, then the fact that it is a mixture is to its glory and not its condemnation, as some people accuse the church of having sinners in it. That's what the church is for, folks, so sinners can come and learn the truth of God. However, we can glean one more lesson from this parable, and that is, it unmistakably lays down that there is a process of selection which is going to take place in the end. It gathers, the saying that it gathers all things, but there's going to be a selection. The good's going to be kept and the bad's going to be thrown away. Every moment that we live, we are judging ourselves. That is why even the trivial things in our lives are important. In every little action, we show whether we are courteous, whether we are kind, whether we are considerate or sympathetic, whether we are honest, and whether we set the highest values on the right things. So we're back to the point which we looked at in the parable of the wheat and the tares. When a person is faced with Jesus Christ, his reaction is his judgments on himself. Therefore, judgment is not delayed for those of us in the church until the end, for we are judging ourselves, in every action, every day now, those of us in the church. We are deciding every day whether we are the good who will be gathered in or the bad who will be cast away out of the net. And that, my friends, is a sobering thought. Okay, let's continue on to another parable and to another lesson Jesus is trying to instill in our minds as to what the kingdom is like. And that is the parable of the mustard seed. This short parable is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. However, there's a slight difference as how it is narrated in Luke than in Matthew and Mark. So we'll begin as it is told in Matthew and Mark. First, let's read the parable. Matthew 13:31. Get back over here. 13:31. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. He tells this parable, but he doesn't give us an explanation like he does some of the other parables. In Palestine, the mustard seed was proverbial for the smallest of all things. Although it's not strictly true that it's the smallest of all seeds. A mustard seed is small, but there are many other seeds smaller than a mustard seed. It was universally used in Palestine as the type of anything that was extremely small. In Matthew 17:20, Jesus spoke of faith of a mustard seed, insinuating, of course, that even a small amount of faith could do great things. And according to my research, to this very day, the Arabs have a phrase about faith weighing not more than a mustard seed, a grain of mustard seed. In Matthew and in Mark, the clear point of the parable is the fact that in time the smallest seed grows into the largest of herbs. Now, it tells us that things sometimes start small but can grow into something great. Mustard in Palestine was not a little garden plant like we plant in our gardens here, but rather it was a field plant, which, because of the height of which it grew, it commonly grew to a height of 7 or 8 feet, and its branches did look like the branches of a tree. It was a completely different variety of mustard than we plant in our gardens here. So there is no exaggeration in the parable of the mustard seed on this point. And it's quite true that birds come and nested in its branches. They are often to be seen settling in scores on the mustard plants because of the small little black seeds which they pick out of the pods. So then the first lesson of the parable is, though a thing may start from the smallest beginnings, it may end by being something very great. When Jesus first spoke this parable, it undoubtedly had a special meaning for the disciples themselves. There can be no doubt that they were bewildered and discouraged somewhat. They had hoped for so much, and so little had happened. For they were looking for a Messiah to relieve them from the Roman oppression. It seemed, in fact, that even the little that had happened was in serious danger of being engulfed by the growing waves of opposition to Jesus by the religious leaders of the day. The mission of John the Baptist had been extremely impressive. The crowds had flocked out to listen to him and to accept his baptism, its baptism. And John himself had clearly stated that greater days were coming, and still greater things were going to happen. He told them that among them there was one whose shoe he was not worthy to untie, and whose baptism was far beyond anything he could offer or do. And if you want to jot that down, you can read about that in Matthew 3, verse 11, Mark 1, verse 7, Luke 3:16, and John 1, 26 and 27. John the Baptist told them that he must inevitably decrease, as this one who was to come after him must increase. And that's in John 3:30, if you want to jot that down as well, if you want to read that. But words like this could not do anything but to rev up the minds and expectations of the disciples. They were looking for more impressive and sensational things to come. At first, when the crowds flocked around Jesus, it must have looked as if though this were coming true. But bit by bit, as the opposition increased, from the religious leaders. The crowds abandoned him. And it was clear in the minds of many that the mission of Jesus, which had started with such promise, was likely to end in disaster. For they were looking for something entirely different than what Jesus came to do. They had begun with such high hopes, and those hopes were now seemingly to be disappointed. So Jesus told them this parable to help them see that the beginnings might seem small, but no man knew to what extent they could grow. And it would seem impossible to me for them to have listened to the parable and could have not had a glimpse of its meaning. That they were this small beginning, and that everything depended on them. Of course, later on, we know this did dawn upon them in a very profound way. Apart from the truth which the parable sought to make plain to the disciples, it also lays down a truth which is more of a universal truth and is valid for all times, which is the greatest things must always start from the smallest beginnings. All music comes from the octave, or the octave. From these 8 notes comes every hymn, every song, every sympathy which has ever been written, from those 8 notes. All literature in the English language is built on 26 letters of the alphabet. From them comes every great novel, every poem, every great poem, every speech that was ever made, from those 26 letters. And although we live in an age where everyone is trying to build something bigger and worships size and numbers, history proves again and again that it is not the big things, but the smallest things which are of the paramount importance. It has always amazed me that of all the people, out of all those crowds that followed Jesus around, that after his death, resurrection, and ascension, in Acts 1:15, it tells us the total number of the Christian church was only 120. That has always amazed me. Yet out of that small beginning came the true churches of God down through the ages to this very day. So we must never be discouraged by small beginnings and by the apparent limited effects we can have. If something is right and God is behind it, in the end it will grow and it will make its mark. This parable also teaches us that true Christianity is a living organism. All the time the mustard seed was growing. It was very small when it was planted. All the time it was growing, though. From day to day and from hour to hour, that growth was not visible or measurable. But when you take the beginning and compare it to the end, the growth was plain for all to see. In our world, everyone is in a hurry. Nobody has any patience anymore. Everyone wants everything to happen in the flash of an eye. But very seldom do things happen that way. And we may think that anything we can do is so little to be of any effect. But the combined effects of the small efforts of true Christians can be used mightily by God in the bringing in of his kingdom. This parable also has a relevance concerning our conversion. As something very small in the beginning and growing to where we are today. However, there are exceptions to this, such as Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road. What happened to Paul was a sudden reversal, which turned his life upside down. But for most of us, it was a gradual experience, starting small, learning little by little, growing into something larger. So it's wrong to take one conversion experience and make a standard for all. Therefore, no one should think he has missed something because he didn't have some shattering experience in his or her conversion. Now let's turn to Luke's version of this parable. Luke makes no mention about the seed being small, or the mustard seed being the smallest of seed. His point is that someday the birds of the air came and lodged in the branches. One thing this pictures in the Bible is that it is a vision of some great empire. And that empire is visioned as a great tree with many branches. And the birds on the branches are the people who are part of that great empire and who find their peace and their safety within it. Ezekiel makes use of this picture in Ezekiel 17, verses 22 through 24. And also in chapter 31. If you care to look that up, read it. This is an analogy which is also used in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, where King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of this great tree where the leaves and the fruit were fair and plentiful and produced food for everyone. And the beast of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heavens dwelt in the boughs thereof. Of course, this pictured King Nebuchadnezzar's empire, as was explained by Daniel on over in verses 20 through 22 of chapter 4 there. So then Luke's idea is that the parable means that the kingdom is like a great tree with many branches in which many people shall find rest. And I think that's a good analogy. And here's a thought to think about. Just a thought of mine. Just a thought. By implication, it could mean that it doesn't matter how many branches there are in the church, so long as they are all stemmed in the basic truths of God. So we could look at this also as a warning against exclusivism. Because so often people insist that their way, their church alone, has the way to salvation. If you don't belong with them, you're not going to make it. Not realizing that salvation is a personal thing between you and God. Sometimes the fact that there are so many churches of God, people look at it as a condemnation against us. But the point of fact is, it can also be one of the church's greatest virtues. For a lot of people in God's churches have many different backgrounds, and they don't all fit in with one style. Now, there's nothing wrong with a man or a woman thinking of themselves as a member of a certain congregation, and thinking of himself as a member of a certain branch of the church and loving that certain branch. But beyond his congregation and beyond his branch of the church, he must remember that he is a member of the Church of Christ or Church of God at large. And that his branch is not the only true branch of God's church. It is only one branch of many around the world. And amidst all our differences, let us remember that it is Christ who unites us. He is the tree in whom all the branches are stemmed, and from whom all draw their life, and from whom all will find rest in his branches. Let's see here. Yeah, I've got time for one more, I guess. Let's look at one more parable. The next parable we'll look at is in Matthew 13:33. Another parable spoke he unto them. The kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. Very short parable. Got 16 pages of notes on that. Not really. In this case, when Jesus wanted to paint a picture of the kingdom, his thoughts undoubtedly undoubtedly went back home. In Palestine, it is said, at least in the smaller towns and villages, there was no such thing as a baker's shop. Currants and bunny bread, they just weren't around, you know. Bread was made at home in these small towns. Jesus undoubtedly had seen his mother Mary making bread as he grew up. When she was baking bread, she took leaven, as did any other woman, and which was a little lump of dough which had been kept over from the previous baking, and which in the keeping had fermented, had yeast in it. The leaven was inserted in the dough, and it changed the whole character of the bread, which emerged. So in this analogy, Jesus is saying, just as the leaven changes the character of the dough into which it is inserted, so will the kingdom of God change all things. There is one difficulty in this parable, however. Very commonly, leaven in Hebrew thought and language was a synonym for evil influence. In Mark 8:15, Jesus advised his disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. Twice, once in 1 Corinthians 5:16, and again in Galatians 5:9, Paul uses the phrase, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, as he is exhorting the Corinthians to have nothing to do with the things which have evil influences. And when a man entered the Jewish religion and then relapsed into his Gentile ways, he was said by the rabbis to have returned to his leaven. And according to my research, the Jews believed that in a man that there were two opposite tendencies, one drawing him to goodness and the other drawing him towards evil. They call them the good nature and the bad nature. And often they call the bad nature leaven. And we know even today when the Passover comes, we are to clear all leaven out of our houses because it represents wrong things. The Jews usually use leaven as a synonym for bad influence. This may be because they identified fermentation, which is a process that goes on within the dough when it rises, with rottenness, or decay. And leaven seemed to them something which induced decay into that which it was placed. But at the same time, leaven is sometimes used in a good sense. Although it is usually used in a bad sense, leaven can also be used for positive, persuasive influence. Now, there are different interpretations of this parable, although they come much to the same end. Some see it as a symbol of the disturbing influence of true Christianity. They see the working of the leaven in the dough as an explosive process. At first, it is true the leaven is hidden in the dough and nothing appears to happen. But soon the whole mass begins to swell and bubbles as the fermentation rapidly increases. They see the leaven turning the dough into a seething mass as an analogy of the influence of true Christianity being profoundly disturbing. And it's true. The revealed truth of the Bible is a disturbing thing to most people. It is. 1 Kings 18:17. When evil King Ahab came face to face with Elijah, the prophet, he said unto him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And in one sense, it was the duty of Elijah to trouble his fellow countrymen and in order to make them think. Also in Acts 17, verse 6, when true Christianity first came to Thessalonica, the cry was, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." And if you want to jot down Acts 16:20, in Philippi, the accusation against Paul and his friends was, these men are Jews and they are disturbing our city. So, true religion is disturbing to a lot of people. And that's good in a way. German philosopher Karl Marx is famous for saying that Christianity was a drug. He said it was the opiate of the people, or the masses, and that it taught men to endure things in which they should have rebelled. True Christianity, on the contrary, is always revolutionary by nature. Now, I'm not saying that it teaches you to rebel against your government, unless, of course, the government is in direct conflict with the Word of God. I'm not saying that it teaches you to rebel against your parents or your teachers, for it certainly doesn't. That's not what I'm talking about. Let's go to Luke 1 and 51. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Well, overshot the runway here. Luke 1. (51) through 53 here. It says, He has shown strength with His arm. He has scattered the proud into the imaginations of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their seats and exalted the ones of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich He has sent away empty. He's saying here that He's brought down rulers from the thrones, but He has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but He sent the rich away empty. And that He has performed mighty deeds with His arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their innermost thoughts. And these three verses are three revolutions which true Christianity and a true Christian must carry out. First, there is a moral revolution. The proud are brought down, it says. So true Christianity must begin by working a revolution within our hearts and our minds. And if you can remember when you were first called of God, you will know there was a revolution going on in your mind. It does this by making us see who we actually are. And when we think about the life of Christ, we cannot help but compare our life with His. And that comparison can bring us nothing but shame when we think about it. We may think that we're really good at something. Maybe we think we're a good golfer. Maybe we think we're a good basketball player. Maybe we think we're a good musician. But when you go and see the masters play, it makes us realize how inadequate we really are. So when we compare our life to the life of Christ, it makes us realize just how far we come up short. And furthermore, when we realize the love the Father in Christ has shown, and to the end, or to the length that love went, it should be, it should amaze all of us what He has done for us. And it should fill each one of us with a desire to change our lives for the better. Second of all, there's a social revolution. It says the mighty are brought low and those of low degree are exalted. That is because God and true Christianity also has no respect for the labels which the world attaches to a person. The world places a man according to the size of his bank account and the number of people he can control and his prestige in whatever field of work, that he may be doing. But God rates a man by the service he renders to his fellow men. Jesus told the disciples, Mark 10:43 through 44, whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister or servant, and whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be your minister and servant. So the result is that man whom the world accounts as being great may well be nothing in the kingdom of God, while the man who appears of no standing in the world may well be one of the greatest. There's a story of a certain Russian nobleman. He kept an open house. Anyone who wished to come into his house could come in and sit at his table. However, a man's place at that table was decided by one simple test. When he arrived, the nobleman would say, "Show me your hands." If a man's hands were calloused and worn from toil and work, the guest received a high place to sit. But if a man's hands were soft and flabby, he was directed to sit at the lowest seat. So the test of true Christianity is a test of service. Number 3, there is an economic revolution. It says the hungry are filled with good things and the rich are sent away empty. In a true Christian's mind, there should be a feeling of responsibility that we could not bear to have so much while others have so little. And this leads us back to Mark 10, 43 through 44, where we just looked at a while ago. That he who would be greatest among you will be the greatest servant of all. So it is clear that when you take the leaven as a disturbing influence in the dough, this parable teaches the disturbing influence of true Christianity on the life of the individual and of the world. And there is another way you might interpret this parable. And that is, the leaven stands for subtle or gradual influence of the kingdom. We can no more see leaven working than we can see a plant grow. But it's working and it's growing all the time. And so the power of the kingdom, so is the power of the kingdom is what I'm saying. It's working all the time too, though you may not see it at all times. And further, this parable teaches that the influence which changes men must come from the outside. Before any result could begin in the dough, the leaven had to be inserted inside. Now, we live in an age which puts great emphasis on external things. We believe that if we can give men better houses and better working conditions, we will make better men out of them. And it is true that the influence of the church must, be with all efforts to improve the lot of men. But the fact remains that no man can change until his heart is changed. No man can change until that leaven is put in there to make him start to grow. And there's another truth which follows from what we've been considering. And that is, the dough had no power to change itself. The power which was to change it was the leaven. And it had to come from the outside. As so, men have no power to change themselves. There are few people who have not made resolutions and seen those same resolutions and plans come to nothing. So positive influence must come from the outside. Archimedes, and if you don't know who Archimedes was, he was a Greek mathematician, engineer, and physicist. One of the greatest of the old times. He discovered that if you placed a lever below a mass of anything, you could lift that mass. And the longer the lever, the bigger the mass that could be lifted. In the end, he came to the conclusion, and he said this: give me a lever long enough and give me a place outside the world to stand, and I will lift the world. He knew well that the lifting must come from the outside. And if we are to be changed, and if the world is to be changed, that change must come from a power that is not our own. It must come from the power of God. 2 Corinthians 5:17 tells us, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation, and the old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. And Christ also says in Revelations 21:5, behold, I make all things new. Now, there's one other lesson in this parable which may have been meant specifically for the Jews. When the leaven was put into the dough, it was dispersed. It ceased to exist by itself, but by losing its own existence, it altered the whole character of the dough. And it may be, I'm saying, that Jesus foresaw a day when the Jewish nation would be destroyed, and I think he did, and scattered, and the temple destroyed. And yet, that very dispersal of the Jews was to change the world. The Jews would lose their nationhood, but yet they would do something for the world that no one else could do. They had such influence on the world that the Romans used to say that the conquered had given laws to the conquerors. They accepted a lot of the Jewish law. When the Jews were scattered, they took with them their synagogues, so that there was a synagogue in almost every town of importance in the ancient world. They took their laws, they took their scriptures, so that even many non-Jewish people came to know about what was written in the Old Testament. And many heathen came to know the true God and the true Sabbath by their dispersal. So the dispersal of the Jews was, in a real sense, the leaven which prepared the world for the spreading of true Christianity, which was brought by Jesus Christ.